Goethe said, "In all times, only individuals have worked for knowledge, not the ages themselves." It was the age that put Socrates to death with poison, the age that burned Huss. The ages have always been the same. All conception of plans presumed to be the basis of history contradict the historical method as it arises from the nature of history itself. This is a little bit more on the cognition and psychological nature of human beings within the mind itself. This is again from Goethe's work translated by Rudolf Steiner called Goethe's Theory of Knowledge, a phenomenal book of philosophy, primarily in the areas of epistemology. Really forces you to think deeply. His ability to lead the reader into such deep thoughts in a clear, coherent way is very impressive. Here we go. I'll be reading a little more. The first part is called Psychological Cognition. The first science in which the mind deals with itself is psychology. Here the mind observes itself face to face. Fichte, which is, I think his name is Fichte. It's Fichte. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. He's another philosopher of the age. Fichte assigned an existence to human individuals only to the extent that they ascribe this existence to themselves. In other words, the human personality has only the traits, characteristics, and capabilities that it ascribes to itself through insight into its own being. So here again, we see Goethe explaining that being is in itself defined by being itself. Consciousness is in fact conscious of itself. And to that extent that it is conscious of itself, that's the extent of the expression of the human being or the human spirit. There's really no limit to this expression. In a previous video, he talks about that the limitations of the human mind are imposed on the human mind by the human himself. Fichte was wrong to suppose that he could base all knowledge of the universe on this truth. Nevertheless, it is destined to become the highest principle of psychology, whose method it determines. If the human mind possesses a characteristic only to the degree that it attributes to itself, then the psychological method involves the mind being absorbed in its own activity. Thus, this method is self-apprehension. Of course, we are not limiting psychology to the science of characteristics of any individual human being. We instead separate the individual mind from its accidental limitations and unimportant traits, and try to lift ourselves to consideration of human individuality in general. Indeed, it is not important that we consider the wholly chance individual, but that we become clear about the self-determining individual in general. Anyone who might want to say at this point that we should then be dealing only with the type of humanity that confuses the type with the generalized concept. It is essential to the type that it stands as the universal in contrast to its single forms. This is not essential to the concept of the human individual. Here, the universal acts directly in the individual being, but this activity expresses itself in various ways according to the object toward which it directs itself. The type exists in single form and, as such, comes into reciprocal activity with the external world. The human mind has only one form. Nevertheless, certain objects move one's feelings, or an ideal inspires one to act, and so on. We must not deal with a particular form of the human mind, but always the entire and complete human being. So I'll pause real quick. All of that last few minutes is really summed up in that statement, is that we need to think holistically. We need to see ourselves and the universe as a whole without limits, really. This is the, age-old adage of the universe is infinite. And then how does man cognize that? Infinity is a tough thing to cognize. Okay, moving on. We must release the human mind from its surroundings in order to apprehend it. If we wish to arrive at the type, we must ascend from the single form to the elemental form. If we wish to arrive at the human mind, we must ignore its expressions or particular acts, observing it in and of itself. We must discover how it behaves in general, not how it has behaved in some particular situation. In the case of the type, we must separate the universal form from the single forms. In psychology, we must separate the single form only from its surroundings. For psychology, it is no longer the case, as in the organics, that we recognize, in particular, being the formation of the general or elemental form. In perceiving the single forms, we recognize that elemental form itself. The human mind is not one expression of its ideal, but its exact expression as a whole. Jacobi is mistaken to believe that when we become aware of our inner being, we also perceive that a uniform nature is its basis, meaning intuitive self-apprehension. In actual fact, we become aware of this uniform nature itself. In this way, what is otherwise intuition becomes self-contemplation. This is also essentially a necessity with regard to the highest form of being. The highest form of content that the human mind can attain is what it can read out of phenomena. If it then reflects upon itself, it must recognize itself as the direct manifestation of the highest form, even as its vessel. What the mind finds as unity in multiform reality, it must find in its own individuality as direct existence. What the mind contrasts as the general with the particular, it also attributes to its own individuality in its essential nature. From all this, it becomes clear that we cannot develop genuine psychology unless we penetrate the nature of the human mind through its own activity. In place of this method, the subject of psychology today has not been the human mind itself, but the appearances through which the mind expresses itself. It is supposed that the mind isolated outer expressions can be related externally, just as we relate the facts of inorganic nature. In this way, we try to establish a theory of the soul without soul. Our reflections make it clear that by using such a method, we lose sight of the most important thing. We should loosen the human mind from its outer manifestations and instead recognize it as their source. Psychologists restrict themselves to outer manifestations and lose sight of the mind. In this way, they have allowed themselves to arrive at a mistaken view that would apply the methods of mechanics, physics, and such to all sciences. So, a little aside right there. Applying the methods of mechanics, physics, and such to all sciences is kind of an interesting thing. Goethe also wrote an incredible amount of scientific work and metaphysics, and Steiner put it together in a book called The Light Course, which is fantastic. I think any scientifically minded person or mathematician should read that book, because it really goes into explain how unaware our scientists of the modern era are of their own bias within almost every experiment that we do, and thus tainting the experiment. They're sort of unaware of the most important variable in any controlled experiment, and that variable is their own bias. Okay, moving on. We experience the soul as such, just as we do this single actions. Everyone is aware of the fact that our I gives rise to our thinking, feeling, and willing. Every activity of our personality relates to this center of our being. If we ignore this union with personality in any activity, then the activity ceases to be a manifestation of the soul. It then falls into the category of either inorganic or organic nature. If two balls lie on a table and I knock one against the other, all that happens is resolved into a physical or physiological event, so long as we ignore my intent and will. In all manifestations of the human mind, thinking, feeling, and willing, the point is to recognize these in their essential nature as expressions of the personality. This is the basis of psychology. However, human beings are not just self-contained, but also belong to a society. The activities and achievements of both the oneself and one's folk group are made manifest in the individual. The individual mission of each human being also fulfills the mission of that person's larger community. The important thing is that the position of each person within the community allows the power of that individual to develop its full effectiveness. This is not possible unless the social group is the kind in which each human being can find an appropriate place to work, and finding such a place must not be left to chance. Determining how the individual lives within a community is a matter for sociology and political science, as a social group is the subject of these sciences. They must show what form of organization the state must assume if the spirit of the community is to be expressed within it. The constitution that a group provides for itself must be developed in its innermost nature. Here, too, significant fallacies exist. One does not tend to regard political science as an experiential science. It is believed that the constitution of every group of people can be determined according to the central template. In truth, the constitution of a people is simply its individual character, firmly established in forms of law. Those who would indicate the direction of a society's activity must refrain from imposing anything externally. The direction should simply express the unconscious character of the people. As Goethe says, it is not the intelligent person who rules, but intelligence itself. Not the rational person, but reason itself. To understand the spirit of a community to be rational is the method of sociology. Humanity belongs to a whole whose nature involves the organization of reason. Here, too, we may cite Goethe, quoting, "The rational world is to be conceived as a great, immortal individual who continually brings into being what is needed, and in this way even becomes the master over chance." End quote. Psychology investigates the nature of the single individual. Likewise, sociology must investigate that immortal individuality. Thank you. Please share.